Inti Creates is probably most famous for their work on the Mega Man series, spearheading the Mega Man Zero and ZX games, as well as their work on Mega Man 9 and 10. Inti Creates wouldn't want you to know this, so don't tell them I told you, but they also developed Mighty Number 9. Due to that PR nightmare, they no longer work with Capcom or have access to the Mega Man brand. Since their exile, they've made a name for themselves as basically the Japanese Way Forward. Like Way Forward, their lineup shows fantastic pixel art and a clear love for the retro titles of the 80s and 90s, with spiritual successors like Bloodstained and retro revivals like Blaster Master Zero. This isn't a shot in the dark. Inti Creates collaborated with Way Forward developing games in the Shantae series like Pirate's Curse and Half Genie Hero. Also, they make Galgun. Their flagship title being Azure Striker Gunvolt, a kind of Mega Man Zero with blackjack and hookers, an opportunity for Inti to explore the action platformer using everything they learned from the Mega Man series without the constraints of it, starring a hero who feels like a synthesis of the series' two most prominent characters. I played the demo when it first came out, but due to lack of funds, I never got to check out the final game. I guess at some point I blinked and fell into a black hole because there's already 4 of these damn things. I'm going to start with the Gunvolt games and cover the Luminous Avengers series in a separate video. Since Capcom is never going to let me see my kids again, and Gunvolt 3 right around the corner at the time of writing, I figured now is as good a time as any to finally jump in and see what Inti Creates has been up to for the last—
Good lord, how has it already been 8 years?
Gunvolt's setting has less in common with the robotics of the classic series and more in common with X-Men or the anime Darker Than Black. People around the world developing superhuman abilities, like for example the ability to control electricity. It actually has a pretty interesting take on the mutant premise, even if it doesn't really do anything with it. Adepts are accepted in society, not for any compassionate reason, but because corporations can use them to further their advantage. Like I said, the game doesn't really do much with this premise, but I think it's a unique setting that could tell some interesting stories about corporations turning people with superhuman abilities into brands and influencers to further their grip on our minds and wallets, and the ethics of corporations having access to living weapons. The evil Sumeragi Corporation is up to no good, and a plucky resistance is trying to stop them. Gunvolt, the titular Azure Striker, is sent by the resistance to assassinate Hatsune Miku, who Sumeragi has been using to control the minds of the masses with her beautiful songs. But Gunny Boy finds out that Miku is actually powered by a little girl named Jewel. He decides to rescue her and try to protect her from the corporation that seeks to abuse her powers. That's really all the game needed to set up its story, but the actual storytelling is super cluttered. The game sets up a bunch of support characters, including Gunvolt's boss and mentor, Asimov, who insists he still carry out his mission and murder this little girl. Then saying, "What are you gonna do about reinforcements? You expect us to take care of them?" Gunvolt hands in his resignation so he can dedicate his time to taking care of Jewel. Then Asimov says, "Don't worry about the reinforcements, we'll take care of them." None of this would be that bad, but the next day, Gunvolt starts working for Quill as a freelancer, and all the support characters they set up are here for the rest of the game, so what was the point of him quitting? It just makes a pretty simple premise just all the more cluttered. So we play as Gunvolt. If this series is going to be a successor to Mega Man Zero, it better have a cool as hell main character. So does he live up to his predecessors? Yeah, he's pretty cool. He's cool-headed and confident, but he's not so stoic that he's unwilling to smack talk his opponents. Not like this dialogue is amazing, but I just appreciate that he has a sense of humor at all. There are a few cringers in here.
"The Muse always had a way of photobombing the moment,"
was a line that made me wince in 2014 and still haunts me to this day. His eagerness to take care of Jewel is a little weird since he basically drops everything in his life to take care of this girl he's never met, but it does show his compassionate side. When I played this game, I was under the impression that Jewel was really little, like 8 or 9, and Gunvolt was 18, 16 youngest. Then I got this achievement. Turns out Gunvolt is 14 and Jewel is 13, which makes the idea of Gunny being Jewel's guardian make a lot less sense.
That's just like hiring a slightly bigger child.
It does make the implied romance between them less creepy, at least. He's by no means a super deep character, but he's a likable enough main character for this kind of game. I'd say I'm 12 for a cocky teenager who shoots people with lightning and a gun. He works with, not for, the pro-mutant resistance, Quill, in an attempt to stop the evil Sumeragi Corporation. Each stage is one of a selection of Sumeragi adepts who make up the game's requisite 6 to 8 bosses that comprise the Mega Man formula. So does Gunvolt bring anything new to that formula? As the title implies, Gunvolt can control electricity. Shooting enemies places these little markers on them. You can have up to 3 marks at any time, you can apply multiple marks to one target, or disperse them over several. Pressing the right bumper activates your flash field, which can destroy certain projectiles and displace others, and launch bolts of electricity at marked targets. This is your real source of damage. The shield also has Gunny's Slow as Descent, which lets you use it as a platforming tool. This is all managed by your EP meter. The meter fills back up over time, but takes a really long time to even start charging. By default, overheating actually recharges faster than just waiting. You can manually recharge instantly by double tapping down while grounded, but this causes the player to come to a complete stop. It kind of feels like you solve all your problems by just holding down the lightning button, and maybe it would have been more interesting to make the shield, lightning, and hover into separate verbs that the player had to choose between. I remember getting hit a lot since you can't use the lightning attack in the air without floating around like a doofus. I also wonder if the lightning would feel better if instead of holding it down you would press it once and deal a big burst of damage depending on the number of marks, resulting in a satisfying crack of lightning, instead of just holding it down and chipping away at enemies. I feel like Gunvolt's mechanics just reward playing in a really cowardly way, marking targets and hiding around corners. It works for a lot of situations, and I won't say that it's not enjoyable, but it feels like a bad fit for the character. I'm the Azure freaking striker. I think the game doesn't do enough to get the player playing aggressively. You deal more damage if your barrier is overlapping with them and you're hitting them with your lightning, but it's not a super noticeable difference. What if the barrier could push enemies away and you could combine that with air dashes to turn Gunvolt into a static wrecking ball and crash into enemies? I criticized the Mega Man Zero games for not really changing the movement system from the X series. While the movement is still pretty much the same, there were a few changes made to it. Dashing is now more of a sprint, so you don't have to mash quite as much, but I think it's a little weird that Gunvolt's sprint runs out after a second, and you can just mash away, so I don't know why you can't just toggle it or hold it down or something. Dashing also no longer lowers your hitbox, so you can't use it to slide under certain attacks, which isn't that big a deal, but it was just one more defensive option the player had access to that's gone now. As you progress, you gain access to air dashes and double jumps. The air dash feels pretty good, but the double jump feels awful. It slows your downward momentum and just keeps you in the air forever. It just feels super sluggish and gross. Both can be combined with the hover to cover a lot of aerial space, but the problem is all these movement options drain from the same resource that your other abilities do, which makes me not want to use them for fear I might burn out or have to recharge. Dashes relying on a meter might be more fun if you could dash until you're at a meter or do little micro dashes that would cost less. Movement is fun, but it's not really innovative and is hindered by the clumsy meter management. Pre-evasion is a mechanic that prevents you from taking damage at the cost of some meter. You're basically invincible to all sources of damage as long as your meter isn't empty. I like the idea of having a Halo-style regenerating shield for this kind of game, since it has the nasty habit of blindsiding the player. But draining from your meter is one more way the player can lose it. As long as you don't care about your score, you can basically stand still and recharge, making you pretty much invincible. Pre-evasion can be disabled by removing the necklace you get at the start of the game, but something the game never tells you is that every necklace has pre-evasion. So if you think that mechanic makes the game too easy, you basically lose an entire equipment slot for the whole game. Which is a shame because some of the other abilities are actually really cool. It'd be better if it was a separate option you could turn off outside of equipment. That way, new players can have a safety cushion to help them through, and hardcore players can turn off their pain inhibitors without giving up on actually cool stuff. Most of the problems with the gameplay come back to this meter. For how much pulls from the meter, there aren't enough ways to get it back without breaking the flow. Manual charging is how you're going to be getting it back for most of the game. I think it works really well in boss fights since you aren't actively pushing forward, but I think there still should have been more ways of getting the meter back. One way could be having meter recharge faster if you're dashing on the ground, kind of like how it works in Guilty Gear or Dragon Ball. The game establishes that Gunvolt basically slurps up electricity, so I think it's a shame there aren't any enemies in the stage that try to attack you with electricity, and actually getting hit by them fills up your meter. Presumably, the Sumeragi Corporation isn't only fighting Gunvolt, so lightning weapons would still be useful. You could argue that they know it makes him stronger and would never use it against him, but that's literally the first thing that happens in the game. Or you could have enemies drop some tasty AA batteries for him to suck on like Jolly Ranchers. Meter management is something I love in games, but having interesting things to spend it on is as important as having interesting ways to get it back, and Gunvolt's meter economy has too few for it not to hold the game back. That's enough about the vault, let's talk about the gun. The core of the Mega Man loop is defeating bosses, copying their weapons, and using them to defeat the next boss. Gunvolt doesn't have sub-weapons. You unlock guns in intervals of bosses defeated, so bosses don't give you specific guns based on their abilities. And the guns in this game are kinda bad. They're all just variants of the Cerberus pistol, which is weird because as we see in his apartment, he's clearly packing heat. We even see these different guns in the loading screens that we never get to use. Cerberus is pretty wimpy and only has one action, shoot. Now, if that sounds stupid, compare that to Mega Man X's 3 levels of charge, which isn't a super complicated system, but still has more going on than just shooting. The ricochet shot is the only one that I found useful, as it lets you mark multiple targets really easily. All of the others seem so niche in their uses, I barely even bothered with them. It's disappointing that they don't give Gunvolt different guns like a machine gun, shotgun, or sniper with various levels of power, range, and fire rates. I'd really prefer a few mechanically distinct weapons that change gameplay than 7 flavors of bland. There also aren't any abilities that change how he interacts with marked targets, like letting him dash to one, pull them over, use them as a meat shield, or throw them. What if you had 2 targets marked and Gunvolt could dash to the first one and then kick them into the second? What if you could siphon energy from marked targets to restore your meter or give yourself a shield? What if you could displace your barrier and place it on them, dealing damage to nearby enemies? This game really lacks a sense of excitement to play with a new toy you get after beating a boss in Mega Man, especially after you realize you're just going to be sticking with a starting pistol. I think the priority may have been to make unique weapons versus useful ones, and making physically distinct weapons might have added a lot of animation work. The problem with making Gunvolt a lightning-themed character is that giving him elemental weapons would kind of contradict that theme, which limits what special weapons he can get, and in the long run, maybe wasn't that great an idea. You can still be an Azure Striker, or blue-armed, and not use lightning. It's just a color. Gunvolt feels like its number one priority was to make a successor to Mega Man, rather than making a game about how cool it would be to control lightning, which maybe should have been the focus. But as it is, Gunvolt doesn't really give the sense of satisfaction of being an uncontrollable force of nature, bolting around at lightning speeds and destroying everything in your path.
Score 1 for Pulse Man.
Or get the diversity and variety of play that you get out of the Mega Man games. Which isn't to say there's no fun to be had, it just feels like the game, as it is, just isn't getting the most out of its premise. You also have access to fighting game style special moves. If you have enough of these little special nuggets, you can activate them. They just regenerate over time after you use them. It's almost always a choice of getting your health back or dealing a gack load of damage. The most powerful one you'll have access to on your first playthrough is Lux Caliber, or Sparks Caliber, depending on who you ask, which does a crazy amount of damage to bosses. After getting it, you'll probably just hold on to it until the boss is at about 1/6 health and just drop them. Which for me made the bosses more repetitive. I never felt a reason to use anything else other than that and the heal, and I never saw a reason not to save it for the last chunk of the fight. Specials also make you invincible, which turn them into a useful defensive option. I think they're fun, but did lead to most of the bosses dying in the same way, and that's even more so for Voltaic Chains, the super you get for completing the game. Kudos is the game's scoring system. You gain them when dealing damage to enemies, and you gain more points the more marks the target has on them when you zap them. Your Kudos cashes out at checkpoints and adds to your point total, which means by skipping checkpoints, you can keep your Kudos chain going even longer and cash out at the end of the stage. But if you die, you'll go all the way back to the beginning of the stage. There are 3 different style systems that are basically a difficulty selection for the scoring system. Fearless drains it out on 1 hit, Cautious drains it after 3 hits, and Gutless never drops it, but you get a lower score at the end. I recommend playing on Cautious early on and maybe graduating to Fearless later, which is turned on by default, unless you don't care about the scoring system. Ironically, Fearless requires the player to play cautiously, and Gutless allows the player to play fearlessly. While I don't care much about my final score outside of the letter grade, I do find maintaining a combo satisfying, but it can be really frustrating since getting hit doesn't always feel fair. Using super moves also cashes out your Kudos, which makes it an interesting split utility and penalty as it saves your current Kudos but interrupts the combo. If you get over 1,000 Kudos in the middle of a fight, it'll start to play one of the boss's unique vocal themes, which sounds like a cool idea, but by the time you have 1,000 Kudos, the boss is basically already dead, so the song gets to play for like 2 seconds. How high your score is determines how many goodies you pick up at the end of the stage, which can be used to synthesize new equipment. The balance is questionable because after my first playthrough, I still didn't have enough material to craft anything. Some of them are percentage RPG bollocks that I never bothered with, and actually cool stuff like air dashes and turning your charge into a spot dodge. But you don't get access to late game chips unless you get the early ones. if you don't craft take less damage or have a 15% chance to not suck ass, then you could be missing out on something actually useful. Some ships even work off the kudos system, putting a cap on it in exchange for a useful buff. The kudos system really lets the player set the difficulty as high as they want without even touching the actual hard mode. What's great is that there's a tangible reward for putting everything on the table. Jewel is kind of the emotional heart of the game. Her Septima allows her to control legendary Vocaloid pop diva Hatsune Miku. It's not really clear if her and Miku are distinct entities or if she's just an outlet for her more brash character traits. Jewel acts mostly like a shy little girl, and Miku acts like, for lack of a better term, kind of a bro. Gun seems to view her as a little sister, while Jewel seems to take a more romantic interest in him, which isn't a problem since they're basically the same age, but I just wish they didn't look like there was a big age gap between them. I'd prefer that a love interest be depicted more as the main character's partner in crime than someone he needs to be the caretaker for. While showing the project, they said they wanted Jewel to be a character that had childish and mature qualities, and rather than doing that, they made a childish character and a mature character and just made them the same person. Jewel doesn't really read as a teenager, which is why when I heard this guy had the hots for her, I was a little confused. He's only 15, by the way. If you compare Miku's design to Jewel's, she looks a lot older. I do like this design a lot, but I kind of wish they went with the middle ground of someone who looks about Gunvalt's age rather than sandwiching him between a younger woman and an older woman who are the same woman. In between missions, you get opportunities to talk to Jewel. I was pretty disappointed how much of this dialogue was just tutorial stuff with very little character building, and after each conversation, the game is sure to let you know that you now feel closer to Jewel. Thanks, game. Talking to Jewel before missions has you invoke Miku, which increases the likelihood that on death, Miku will descend from the heavens and bring you back to life with her beautiful song. What they're trying to do here is systemize that moment from your favorite anime when the main character gets back on his feet and his theme starts playing just in time for him to defeat the bad guy, but that moment would start to lose its impact if it happened every episode. And on my first playthrough, it happened damn near every time I died to a boss. Making you invincible and giving you infinite energy also robs that triumphant moment of ripping victory from the jaws of defeat of any satisfaction. The only way you can take damage during this state is by using your flash field, so you can still die, but it sucks any tension out of these fights. I don't have a problem with mechanics like these being an option for struggling players, option being the key word, but there's no option to just turn it off. If this happens, you just have to restart the fight to get rid of it. It doesn't really bother me anymore because I just stopped dying in this game. But I think less experienced players might be cheating themselves out of a nice challenge by just sleepwalking through these fights. I appreciate that Jewel does serve some kind of function in gameplay, but it's a mechanic that turns interacting with her into a punishment for players seeking a challenge. Jewel's inclusion leaves a lot to be desired. I think the reason she doesn't resonate with me is because she just doesn't get a ton of interactions with Gunvault, so I can't really say that I like or dislike her personality. It looks like this was something they changed in the Switch version with like 40 minutes worth of additional dialogue about her talking about her favorite food and thoughts on social media and other trivial crap that I absolutely want to hear because it's just free characterization. But I played the Steam version, which seemed to have a lot less of that. And that's the version I think that most people are going to play. I just walk away from this feeling pretty lukewarm towards Jewel. I don't hate her, but I find myself wanting to like her more than I do. The levels do make pretty interesting use of Gunvault's flash field. My favorite stage was the one with all the magnetic platforms and panels. It used the level to expand your movement options, and had some pretty tricky navigation. The level where the lights are always going out is an interesting use of the lightning powers, but I don't remember really enjoying it. There are these zombie enemies who can short you out on hit, and are too short to hit. Plus they smeared strawberry jelly on your screen, which can block out your view, and they don't even have to hit you to do this. It's a total pain. The bounce pads in Drill Man stage are pretty fun and synergize with the hover ability. They even get used as hazards. I think this stage does a great job of combating the cowardly playstyle I brought up before. It's always placing the player in positions where there's nowhere to hide and you need to act quickly to avoid getting hit. A lot of the stages have these manual moving platforms that you have to zap to move around, and they make for some pretty tense platforming segments. Turning Gunvault into a bug zapper is pretty funny, and I love that the boss actually takes advantage of the stage's mechanic. I'd love to see that kind of thing more in action games. But I do feel like they're a little unclear, and a lot of times I'm already getting hit before I can react to them. Bugfire stage is pretty boring. They got boxes. The levels are enjoyable enough, but for lack of a better term, they aren't really electrifying. While I don't like that each of the bosses uses the black sclera look, they're all really distinct while still looking like they're part of a cohesive unit, even though they never interact with each other. Each has a different fighting style and makes the player grapple with different mechanics, but offensively, most of the bosses you just need to mark 3 times and just ignore them while holding down the lightning button. Recharge when necessary. The 2 bosses that got around this were J Drilla and Lil Bug, and the only reason they got around this was because they teleport, which removes your markers. This made the fights feel a lot more active since I had to keep connecting shots to refresh my markers. I had to focus on dodging as well as counterattacking instead of just holding down the lightning button. Markers wear off on their own, I found that out the hard way, but they don't wear off quickly enough for it to make a difference, at least not most of the time. You can't just hold down the bumper against Gamagori since his DM sucks you in if you have your barrier up, which is pretty clever because he's magnets. Other than that, he's pretty easy. This problem is probably at its worst when fighting Snakette in Snakina, since your barrier destroys their projectiles, but then they turn into snakes that your barrier also destroys. You only need to watch out for their whip attack and their stone gaze. If you mark both of them, you don't even have to worry about their resurrection move. I didn't really like any of the bosses initially, but I'd say they're mostly solid, if a bit easy, except for this guy. Buckfire's pretty fun on normal, but becomes a complete nightmare on hard. When you realize how his attacks basically have no telegraphs, you can react to his grenade, so it's better to assume that he's going to slide and try and stay in the air. But during his second phase, he gets an attack that hits in the air, and if you're a nanometer off the ground, you're getting hit. And most of his attacks push you into the wall, which, on hard mode, I got stuck on this guy for a solid hour. Don't even get me started on his DM. Here, let me show you how to dodge this. We never get to fight Zonda, but since they're such a memorable encounter, I thought I'd mention them anyway. This was about the time I realized that we weren't playing Mega Man anymore. There's nothing that isn't safe for work about this game, but I was caught off guard by how horny this game is at times.
Silence! Do not talk, you scrumptious thing.
Coming from the very sexless and family-friendly Mega Man series, although we never see it in this game, Zonda appears to be a character who has the ability to change their gender at will.
Look at you. You're all boy, aren't you?
And I hear you're a little bit of both.
Man, this character design, do you get it? 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 This is Donda's male form. It just feels really crass and out of place. Not the gender swapping thing, the giant diamond member. It'd be like if Destroy Man was a robot master in classic Mega Man. This analogy works so well that if you don't appreciate it, never speak to me. Having a non-binary or bi-gender character in a video game is pretty rare even now, and this was back in 2014, which is kind of a shame that Zonda just sort of feels like a caricature. Anyway, they get killed by the stage's real boss, Copen. Copen is a character I'll have more to say about when we get to Gunvolt 2. All you need to know about him now is that he's really racist. What's cool about this fight is that he uses abilities from each of the bosses you've defeated up to that point, which changes the boss depending on your route. It's a little weird that he's getting abilities from bosses that I'm defeating, but whatever. What's not cool is that his default attack is him slowly walking forward and squeezing his gat, which is really difficult to dodge without just jumping over him. It is cool that he reacts to you jumping over him, making him seem a little more intelligent. There's just something really boring about this attack, like it's not really flashy to look at, and it's not super fun to dodge. One of his most common attacks is this purple ball shot that basically turns off the core game mechanic if you get hit. You just have to wait to get it back, and getting hit while it's off extends the time, which creates a negative feedback loop. One thing I liked about Mighty No. 9 was the sense that you were rescuing your fellow Mighty Numbers. Beck's enemies were malfunctioning robots that needed to be repaired. Villains becoming rehabilitated was also an idea explored in Mega Man Powered Up and in the Archie comics, and made them feel like they were more than just obstacles to overcome, and made the heroes seem more compassionate for at least offering their enemies an alternative. In Gunvolt, you straight up just ice them. There's something grim about browsing the Gunvolt wiki and seeing how many named characters are deceased and how most of them were teenagers. Making it more about breaking Sumeragi's control over adepts or incapacitating them would make Gunvolt seem more heroic. If you're a madman, you could even make this a gameplay mechanic.
Here are 4 systems I thought up while editing this video.
Electricity is a great choice for a character who fights non-lethally, since we associate it with incapacitating people with stuff like tasers. You could even have Gunvolt wear power limiters so he doesn't go overboard and kill anybody, and then take them off when someone goes too far and needs to die. Much like the coolest video game character, we aren't talking about robot animals, we're talking about human beings. As it is now, Gun's not a violent psycho who revels in all the killing, but he clearly has no problem taking other people's lives, which could be an interesting dimension of his character to explore, but since I know they aren't going to do that, I don't see why this game needed to have as much murder as it has. This is especially uncomfortable during the fight with Elise, not because she's a woman, but because she's very clearly mentally ill and not in control of her actions. I normally don't like Inti's approach to higher difficulties. Rather than make the player take advantage of all of their mechanics, they tend to take mechanics away. Hard mode removes special moves and the synthesis system. They also amp your recharge time to the point where it's comically long. Prevasion is still equipable, but due to the insane overheat times, it's completely unusable. The game amplifies your damage intake to the point where everything basically kills you in 2 hits or less. This turns every hazard into a sizable threat, and means you can't just run in playing carelessly. It turned the game into a really satisfying challenge, and what made it enjoyable for me was that the game didn't disable checkpoints. It made the moment-to-moment gameplay really challenging without becoming any more punishing. It was some of the most fun I had playing this game, and actually changed my opinion of a few of the bosses. What made it more fun was that they didn't amp up the boss's health. So while you died in 2 hits, bosses still didn't take that long to beat. High lethality with low penalty is generally my preferred kind of difficulty when it comes to action games. It might not be everyone's, but it's definitely mine. Turning off supers kind of irritated me at first, but it means you actually need to figure out how to get past bosses' desperation moves, and learn how they work. I'm still not sure why it needed to be a separate save game, since with the synth system disabled, all rewards I get for beating stages are literally useless, especially since it's basically impossible to win without getting an S rank on hard. But the satisfying challenge was its own reward. The amped meter drain was a funny way of disabling prevasion, but in the rare instance you do short out, it's so long that I usually just kill myself to skip it. I'm not kidding when I say that hard mode would be more fun if shorting out straight up just killed you. This isn't a joke. Pushing yourself to the limit on the knife's edge between death and suicide. I don't know, sounds pretty badass to me. 6. While I enjoyed hard mode, I didn't do a full playthrough of it because I don't need to play that last boss again with even less health just to find out that it still isn't fun. Gunvolt kind of doesn't have a story. It's got a setting, it's got characters, and a tiny plot that happens at the very end, but not much connecting the first and second halves. Sumeragi doesn't have a big evil plot that the heroes are aware of, and Quill doesn't have a plan to take out Sumeragi. Jewel getting kidnapped is essentially the story's inciting incident, but that doesn't happen until after you've defeated the main 6 bosses. Gunvolt's structure feels more like a TV show than the kind of linear narratives you normally see in movies or games, with a pilot, 6 episodes, and then a 4-part season finale. I'm not saying the story is bad because it strays from convention, it's just that this sort of structure is really rare in games, and I'm not even sure if it was intentional. The fact that I didn't notice it until writing this video means that it wasn't a deal breaker. The reason it wasn't a deal breaker is because regardless of what Gun was doing, I always knew the answer as to why he was doing it, so he can get money to take care of Jewel. The idea of Gunvolt coming home after a hard day of work and cracking open a Duracell and spending time with Jewel is a pretty comfy and wholesome idea. It would have been nice to have more of that, but it wouldn't be able to have that tone at all if we knew Sumeragi was building a giant death laser or that Quill was planning some big coup d'etat and that there was a ticking clock looming over us. All I'll say is that if Gunvolt had to stick with his unconventional plot structure, I just wish it got more out of it. So, after Gamer Jones shows up to kidnap Jewel, you need to chase after her, ripping through a classic Mega Man boss gauntlet before showing down with the villain. Nova is the main villain, I guess. He's Hatsune Miku's abusive manager, and the closest thing Sumeragi has to a leader in this game. Nova has so little presence as a villain that I had to look up what his name was. The Sumeragi Corp really needed a stronger lead than this Organization 13 reject. They needed a real tech daddy CEO type, a Dr. Wily for the Twitter age. His plan is to hook up Jewel to some machine so that he can use her powers to hog all the royalties from album sales. He doesn't really explain what he plans to do with Jewel's power, so I'll just assume that he wants to take over the world. He fuses with her and then turns into a giant video game final boss. This fight is the lowest point of the entire game. The first phase has some interesting ideas. He has a barrier that reflects your shots back at you, which punishes careless shooting. You can jump through the center of these hoop attacks, and these screen-filling orb attacks are pretty fun to dodge, but two things just kill this fight. You can destroy his barrier by hitting it with the flash field, but the problem is the window for damaging him is so short that if you can't connect a single shot, it comes right back almost immediately. This fight would be so much more tolerable if the barrier stayed down for at least 3 seconds. And this move. This is what's hitting you most of the time. I hate it when bosses just crash into you with no telegraphing. This isn't an attack, he just translates over to you. This fight is at its best when he just has his back to you and you can just wail on him. But don't worry, we're just getting started. Alright, let's get the nice things out of the way. This fight does make use of the game's core mechanic of marking targets. Some attacks are really difficult to dodge and require a degree of precision, which is a good thing, and really tests the player on their movement. But all these cool attacks are just undermined by how tedious damaging him is. You need to damage his core, but his core has a shield. You need to mark and zap both his drones, and then you need to shoot his core once the shield is down. Once you mark it, then you can use your lightning to actually start damaging it. Any second you don't damage it, the shield will regenerate, and the process will basically start right over. The marker timers on both drones are unique, so if one wears off, you won't be able to damage him at all, and you'll have to mark both of them again, and he'll get his shield back. His shield will just come back right in time to block your shots, and this makes what is already a painfully long boss take even longer, and there's just too many barriers in between dropping the shield and actually damaging him. And even if you are attacking him, he can just interrupt you by doing this wind attack. It's such a waste of time. You can't damage him during it, and it's not even remotely hard to dodge. Yes, I've been killed by it. His desperation move basically puts a time limit on the fight, and if you touch it, you're just dead. So you need to kill him before it gets so big that it covers his weak point and just leaves you to lay down and accept your death. I think this fight is genuinely terrible, and it's probably the lowest point of this game, if not the entire series. But there's something that makes this fight even worse that I'll get to later. After defeating Nova, on your way down you bump into Asimov. He congratulates you on rescuing Jewel and succeeding in your mission, and asks you if you'd be interested in rejoining Quill and assisting in the cleansing of the human race.
What did you just say?
Naturally, Gunvolt refuses his offer. Hey, never hurts to ask. And then, Asimov kills him, and then Jewel. But if you collect all 7 of the hidden gems in each stage, Asimov will still kill you. But if you give the rocks to Jewel, Asimov will still kill you. But if you talk to her again, she'll make it into a necklace, and Asimov will still kill you. But if you equip the necklace Jewel gives you, then you can survive and fight the real final boss. I don't know why this needed to have so many steps in it. I broke it down like this because for each example I gave, I fought and beat the final boss only to still get the bad ending. And if you try and be sneaky and put it on in the middle of the stage, you still get the bad ending. Yes, this happened to me while I was recording this video. It's also annoying that every time you give her a jewel, it's the exact same cutscene. It doesn't really motivate you to keep talking to her every time you get one. It'd be cool if each rock gave you a unique interaction that actually made the player feel closer to Jewel and maybe gave a look into her history instead of the same joke about how she secretly wants to smooch him that gets less funny each time because you start to realize it's not a joke. I just wish getting all 7 plot stones just had a cutscene play of Jewel making the necklace and giving it to him. He wore my necklace instead of a piece of useful equipment? How sweet! Yeah, it's almost like it was the only way I could get the true ending in a video game. I don't think it was worth the number of times I had to fight that awful final boss. But what makes all this so much worse is that on my first playthrough I pressed escape during the credits, which closes the game before I could save, and I had to do the fight again! So, instead of dying, Gunvolt receives a near-fatal wound. Jewel is still very much dead, but her Septima, along with her consciousness, just dip out of her lifeless body and move into Gunvolt's. The distinct Miku and Jewel personalities merging into one as Gunvolt's brain doesn't have enough storage space for both of them. With his Tulpa successfully installed, he can now throw down with Asimov for the final battle. It's kind of cool that his attacks parallel the guns you unlock throughout the game, even if it's only like 2 of them, but most of his attacks do the Copen thing where it just turns the fun off. Blocking his barrier with yours is kind of cool, but it feels like it should be more hype than it is, since all you do is just hold down a button. Maybe it'd be a little more active if you had to dash forward to repel him. Honestly, this kind of attack would be way more tense if you had a limited meter and needed to make sure it was up in time to deflect his. At least they tried to do a power struggle without relying on a QTE. If you get hit by one of his meter drain attacks and he charges into you with his shield, there's just no way to dodge it. It's better than the fight with Nova, but that's by no means a ringing endorsement. And what is there to say about his desperation move?
I'm just gonna stomp you, you're gonna keep coming back, I'm gonna seal up all my cracks, you're gonna keep coming back. Why? Cause you keep smelling the syrup, you worthless bitch ass nigga. Your life is nothing. You serve zero purpose. You should kill yourself now!
I really like the idea of this battle, of a mentor and student fighting to the death over differing ideologies, while taking advantage of the same fighting styles and abilities. I just wish they were fighting over something more complicated than whether or not genocide was a good idea. Instead of Asimov wanting to just dead-ass end humanity, if he was trying to justify an attack that would deal a fatal blow to Sumeragi at the cost of innocent civilians. That's something you could see an extremist rationalizing even if it's the wrong thing to do, and if Gunvolt couldn't talk him down, then yeah, it'd make a lot of sense that they'd fight over it. Asimov tempting Gunvolt with the thought of revenge might have lent a little more tension if we ever got the sense that it might be something he actually wanted, if Gunvolt resented humanity for the treatment of adepts. Copen represents the worst of what Gunvolt fears humanity to be, and Asimov could represent Gunvolt's growing desire for violent retribution, and the story could end with him overcoming both of them and their toxic ideologies. And in contrast, Zeno and Monica could show us that humans and adepts can live in harmony. I think this could be a cool way to inject some more conflict into his story, because while I do like him, he could be a little less pure and incorruptible. He said it at the start of the game, he's no angel, but he could stand to act like it less. While this fight didn't really land for me, the ending kinda did. It's a pretty grim ending. Gunvolt kills Asimov and the doors open right in time for his friends to see what he's done. Rather than explain what happened, he just walks out without a word. What's he supposed to say? I thought after this, Quill would be hunting Gunvolt down to get revenge. When one of his friends reaches out for him, only for Jewel to swat his hand away, it gives the impression of a toxic relationship where, in an attempt to protect him, Jewel would isolate Gunvolt and make it harder for him to form connections. It's a pretty dark ending and leaves some threads open for a sequel to explore that could make for a really interesting story. Gunvolt 2 doesn't explore any of that. Gunvolt 2 feels a lot more like Gunvolt Episode 2 than a proper sequel. Gun's moveset is basically the same, and he doesn't even get any new weapons this time around. I won't be talking about him that much in this segment because his gameplay is basically unchanged from the first, so I'll mostly be focusing on this game's new addition, the first playable appearance of Copen. Gunvolt 2 features 2 playable characters across 2 campaigns, and naturally the intro stage introduces us to both. Gunvolt and Jewel are intercepting a Sumeragi airship as it's being hijacked, and Copen is looking for his missing sister, during which we meet a ton of new characters, Quinn and Zhao in Gunvolt's campaign, and Lola and Nori in Copen's, ending with them confronting the people responsible. Our main villains this time are a brotherhood of evil mutants, led by Zonda? Zonda's back! Remember them? For some reason, they thought it was a good idea to bring back the joke villain from the first game who you didn't even fight, and make them the main villain. And also make them a little girl? What? This isn't speculation based on her character design. She isn't secretly like 300 or 24. She's 11. The revolution is being led by a 5th grader. Zonda traps Jewel in a mirror and breaks it into pieces, which somehow helps them take advantage of her powers. Gunvolt and Copen both snag a shard of the mirror for themselves. Gunvolt's even giving him a tiny little Jewel to be his buddy. Gunvolt wants all the pieces so he can bring Jewel back to full power. Copen has no idea what they do, but just wants them so Eden can't have them. Plus, getting the mirrors seems to have a positive effect on his sister's previously declining health. It sets up more questions than the previous one and gives the characters more of a concrete goal in retrieving the mirror shards. Playing as both in the intro stage might give the impression that the 2 stories are happening concurrently, but they are happening separately. They fight the same bosses, just in different orders. And the only boss they share in their initial lineup is Tenjin, which is also the stage where you fight the character you aren't playing as. The bosses you don't fight in the first half are then fought during the fortress stages. He's basically the same. Gunvolt felt like the tentative steps into what could be done outside the Mega Man standard. Copen feels like blasting forward on a pair of rocket skates to explore new horizons. This dude feels like a decade of creative ideas being held back by the restrictions of an existing IP finally being set free. If you need an example of how nuts Copen's movement is, just know that this is one button press. Not to dwell on the Pulseman comparison too much, but why is the guy who isn't lightning themed able to do the Pulseman ricochet thing? The core of his kit is his ability to dash on the ground and in the air. Dashing into enemies marks them, which lets him fire homing shots. This brings combat and movement together in a way they never were in the first game. Dashing in the air drains from an ammo system. You start with 3 and can upgrade to have up to 6. It feels kinda like playing with cheats turned on, in a good way. Banking off walls or hitting enemies in midair restores your ammo, meaning you don't want to raw dash as much. If you keep bouncing around corners, you basically never need to slow down. He also has pre-evasion, which costs him ammo, but you better believe I turned that off the first chance I got. He can only dash in 6 directions and can't dash directly up, but does have a fast fall that brings him to the ground. It looks pretty cool and feels fast until you hit the ground where you're locked in place for like 1 frame too long. In addition to his bullet system, Copen also gets sub-weapons from the different bosses. They mostly just deal damage with variations on power usage and range. It's not an impressive lineup, but they're still more diverse than Gunvolt's. Easily the best is Stellar Spark. It's the first one you get, and it's probably the one you're going to be using the most. It's basically Gunvolt's flash field, except it covers like 1/4 of the screen in a straight beam. It also destroys projectiles and has a solid damage output. Combined with his hit scan pistol, Copen puts out enough damage in a large space that he doesn't even need to use his offensive dash. It might be a little too powerful since on my first playthrough I didn't bother with other abilities. It is a nice attention to detail that using it on Gunvolt actually powers him up, but other than that I never felt the need to use anything else. Your weapon meter also powers a passive shield that destroys projectiles when it's full, which means using sub-weapons makes you vulnerable to attacks you could have deflected otherwise. His super options are more limited. It basically breaks down to deal damage or get health back, which is basically all you ever used in the first game, but unlike Gunvolt, his heal and attack are separate resources. Meaning you never have to choose between which one you want in a pinch, which makes it less of a choice. That being said, I don't know what's going on with Copen's super. It does no damage. It doesn't scale off of your kudos or deal more damage the less or more health they have, or the less or more health you have. It also freezes time, so while you can't get hit, you can't really use it to dodge attacks either. So, score 1 for Gunny Boy, I guess. If this is how they wanted to make Gunvolt and Copen balanced, I'd honestly prefer he just not have a super. The number of times I've used it on bosses for them to not die made me not want to bother with it. One of my few complaints is that Copen has this little air cartwheel he does after hitting an enemy, and a lot of times he ends up flipping into hazards. I kind of wish he was invincible during this, or I could influence his direction during the flip. One advantage Gunvolt has is that he can actually see what bosses are doing. Considering these bosses barely telegraph their attacks to begin with, the constant green flashing of Copen's homing shots makes it even harder to tell what they're doing, and makes these fights even less enjoyable. After an air dash, he has this little hover, which he does even if you don't connect the dash. It makes him feel kind of floaty and got me hit a lot early on. You can turn it off using a chip, but there's no way to manually activate the hover without it, which robs you of a useful movement option. And with it enabled, Copen can stay in the air for a really long time. Overall, he feels more snappy and responsive without it, but I just wish I could manually activate the hover when I need it. Copen still has collisions enabled during blinking time, which means after a boss crashes into you, your instinct, if you've played a lot of Mega Man games, is to try and dash to get away from them. But Copen will still bank off of them, preventing you from passing through and most likely just getting you hit again. There's still some kinks to work out, but he's still one of the most creative and fun characters I've played in an action platformer in years. I feel bad saying I prefer playing him to Gunvolt, but that's just because he has so many more mechanics and that the comparison just doesn't feel fair. To give a sense of the gap between Gunvolt and Copen's mechanics, the bosses from Gunvolt's campaign are way easier when you're fighting them as Copen, and the bosses from Copen's campaign are way harder when you're fighting them as Gunvolt. My biggest hope for Gunvolt 3 is that they'll rework his kit to catch him up to Copen's level of complexity, because considering that the new character is a cool girl with a sword, Gunvolt might end up being the weakest link in his own series. At least gameplay-wise. Gunvolt is definitely the better character. I don't think I've ever felt this kind of dissonance between disliking a character's personality but loving their mechanics. Only in video games, baby. Instead of Gunvolt's separate equipment slots, Copen has a memory system with different chips taking up different amounts of memory. It's a little more open than Gunvolt's, as you aren't limited to which chips you can have more than one of, but I think the layout of these things is really annoying to scroll through. Gunvolt has separate logos for different equipment slots, but Copen's chips all look the same. I think a vertical linear menu like this was probably a bad choice since there's so many options. Something like a grid might work better so you don't have to scroll through everything, or a skill tree since you need to craft certain chips to unlock other ones to give you a sense of how they're connected to one another. The equipment is our substitute for difficulty select, as there are chips that make the game much easier and chips that make it way harder. In theory, that might sound like a good idea, but basically what it means is instead of unlocking hard mode for beating the game, you need to grind levels to unlock certain chips to make the game more difficult. There's no reason the game couldn't just give the player the hard mode chips for clearing the game. It's a shame because hard mode was such a highlight from the first game, and I was really looking forward to trying that kind of challenge with Copen since he's such a fun character to play. Modular difficulty is pretty cool when you can customize it to give you the type of challenge you want, but I think this could have been doable without dealing with the synthesis system. You do get a special chip for having Gunvolt 1 installed on your 3DS, which lets you reduce your character's HP to 100 from the start. Copen's increases his damage, while Gunvolt's increases the likelihood of being saved by Jewel. Using this will make you die more often, and make you more likely to get revived, which defeats the point of trying to make it harder. GV is just collecting L's left and right in this game. The equipment system makes difficulty more modular so you can pick and choose which mechanics you want to get rid of in the name of difficulty, but I wish the primary way of interacting with it wasn't grinding. So Copen rock. So Copen's mechanics rock, and Gunvolt is as good as he was in the first game. So this game is a straight upgrade, right? Not exactly. Each boss now reincorporates mechanics from the stage in their fight. Gorina drops Iron Maidens, Aqualad uses the annoying wind tornadoes that are the worst part of his stage, Green Tex uses various traps from his stage, Mad Harriet uses wind to pull and push you, Assrock has these robots that activate in the middle of his stage, which are kind of like how his robot keeps coming back to life. This one's a bad example. Tengen Tetris is fought over slippery surfaces. Run the Jewels uses reflector gems that are barely noticeable. Using stage mechanics in bosses is a great idea, as it makes overcoming the stage give you an edge on overcoming the boss. But it won't make the bosses instantly fun. Bosses love just crashing into you in this game. This was a problem with 2 of the bosses in GV1, but in this game it's nearly every boss. Yes, their movement can be predicted, but just because something is consistent and can be learned doesn't mean the process of learning these fights is intuitive or fun. Mad Harriet will just leap right over to you, and if you try and jump over her, you'll just end up getting hit anyway. Which isn't a problem if you're Copen, but is cold comfort for Gunvolt fans. And the fact that she starts to hide behind the tornado, or worse, the dialogue portraits before doing her lunge just makes it feel like you have no time to react to her. And her stomp move feels super inconsistent, like sometimes she'll just update her position at the last second and just kill you for free. The only boss whose lunge attack feels predictable is Assrock, as it has this really clear wind-up before it. And the only one who doesn't have some kind of melee lunge is Green Tex, which is actually one of the more unique bosses in the game and in the series. Not amazing, but definitely stands out. He's one of the only bosses that actually incorporates platforms into his fights and changes them whenever he teleports. The desperation moves in this game are a total pain. I'll dodge every wave of Harriet's groping hairs just to get hit by the last one and die. And Tengen's is insanely hard to dodge, and your reward for actually pulling it off is him just doing it again. I don't even want to talk about this nightmare. So yeah, I hate these bosses, pretty much across the board. The fight with the villain is less worse than the fight with Nova in the previous game, and one of the better fights overall, but only because the fights in this game are so dire. Definitely made me look more fondly back on the bosses in the first game. But there's one boss whose stage and fight I'd like to talk about in a little more detail. This stage isn't awful, it's one of the more memorable visually. These Iron Maiden traps are really annoying on a first playthrough, but basically provide no challenge on replays. What really brings this mission down for me is the context and tone. One of Quinn's classmates has gone missing, along with some other missing persons reports. There's reason to believe they've all been taken to this spooky castle, and turns out Eden's been kidnapping people and siphoning their blood and turning them into these dried-up zombie guys. The game has a real sense of tonal whiplash when you find out it's all being done by this punky little tsundere. Clashing the really dark subject matter with this walking anime cliche just feels really tacky, like the game can't stop pandering while it's trying to tackle a darker subplot. Quinn's classmate is dead, and now Gunvolt has to deliver this horrible news to her, and it just so happens that the conversation I got after completing this mission was them talking about fried chicken. This wouldn't be a problem if this level wasn't so bleak, and didn't involve one of Quinn's peers being murdered. I don't care about Quinn's classmate, they don't even care enough to give her a name or a face, but knowing that a kid was killed off screen doesn't make me feel good, and certainly puts a damper on the sense of accomplishment when beating the level. It doesn't add anything to the story other than make you hate the villains in a really manipulative way that whittles down any degree of sympathy they could have had. Also, the placement of these zombie guys are super cheap. What the heck, game designers? Oh, and don't think I've forgotten about you. Remember Buckfire? This is this game's Buckfire. Her first phase is pretty easy as Gunvault, but when you get to her second, she discovers Gunvault's greatest weakness. The control key! Okay, her crouching isn't that big a deal. If you have Technos, you can hit her on the ground pretty easily. Her movement is really difficult to predict as she just darts around with no rhyme or reason. Yes, it does follow a set pattern, but actually trying to react will just end up getting you hit. She has this cool fake out lunge attack where she strikes 2 times and then a third, or either tries to fake you out. It's pretty cool, but the difference in her doing it and not doing it is really easy to miss. Also, the screen-filling charge slash that by the time you realize what she's doing, you're already about to get hit by it. With Gunvault's limited movement, it's really difficult to dodge. Guess who doesn't have this problem? And her desperation move is a hell nightmare, but if you can survive her ricochet flip out, you can erase her little blood pimples with your character's shield. It's consistent, but learning this fight was not fun. I'd say she's more consistently predictable than Buckfire, but she's also less fun than him. The whole castle segment is just a very unpleasant experience, and while you can do the levels in any order, it's the first one most people are going to select, and it doesn't really make a good first impression. Ironically, the other levels aren't as offensive, but are also less memorable. Gunvolt 2 has a lot more story than the first one. But what makes it kind of difficult to talk about is that it's kind of a story gameplay sandwich with all the story crammed in at the start and at the end. The connective tissue between beginning and end isn't so much an escalating series of events as it is a group of serialized levels surrounded by as much quirky slice-of-life hangout time as the player can stomach. So before jumping right to the end, I want to talk about the characters in a little more depth. I was mostly indifferent to Jewel in the first game, but she did a real 180 in this one. Who once seemed very nice but shy and timid is now really brash and rude. The fact that her design changes and now she has a voice makes her just seem like a completely different person. In the first one, she was shyly crushing on Gunvault, but in this one, she just kind of declares direct ownership of him without even consulting him. Gunvault will say the most benign thing to Quinn, and Jewel will just go off. Regardless of the conversation, she always has to butt in and make everything about her, which, yeah, is annoying, but wouldn't be a big deal if anyone acted like she was being really self-centered, which might make her self-conscious and result in some change, but no one does. And it's not just Quinn, she also gives Gunvault a really hard time for not actively shunning the only other woman in his life. No one would ever act this possessive of a person they weren't even dating, and even if they did, it would be creepy as hell. They took a character I really wanted to like and turned her into one I can't stand. On the other end of the cattiness spectrum, we have newcomers Quinn and Zhao. Zhao is a boy, so who cares? Quinn is nice. She's always positive, she never loses her temper, she never playfully teases the other characters, she never makes mistakes, she never stands up for herself. She cooks, she cleans, she sews. And she just feels really artificial and just lacks all the imperfections that would make her believable. If they really wanted me to like Quinn, they'd have a few scenes where she busts Gunvault's balls or loses her temper, and one scene where she stands up to Jewel for being such a catty bitch. Traditionally feminine characters are always so much more likable when they've got a little sass to them, and when they're willing to stand up for themselves. This is why the Powerpuff Girls were made out of sugar, spice, and everything nice. And after putting her in her place, it'd be really nice to see Jewel act a little more self-aware and start to develop a friendship with Quinn. You know, some depth. I don't want to hate on Quinn too much. It's loosely implied that she has a history of hunting ghosts, so that's pretty cool. Jewel and Quinn both feel like they exist solely to give the player the fantasy of having cute girls fight over them. This was their top priority. Not to tell either of these characters' stories, but to give the player the fantasy of being the center of attention. There's one scene where Jewel thinks about how Quinn can cook for Gunvault, which is something she can't do without a physical body, slowly realizing that she might be losing him to someone who can provide things that she can't. If I really liked Jewel, then this would be heartbreaking, but Jewel doesn't want to get her body back for her own sake, so she can eat her favorite food or go to school and make friends or experienced sleep paralysis. Everything's gotta be about him. Another scene that made me lose it was when Gunvolt and Quinn were talking about playing the piano, and Quinn mentions that she likes to play Jewel's songs, and that it would be fun to have her sing along with her. This could have been the perfect moment to have Jewel show some humility, flattered that someone would like one of her songs enough to learn how to play it. Music could have been a point of bonding between them, but instead, Jewel just goes off, insulted by the idea that she would ever sing for her, and Quinn just sits there and takes it. Jewel can't show any humility, as it would take away from her jealous little sister shtick, and Quinn can't put this brat in her place because it would take away from her nice big sister shtick. They're just so one-dimensional. I think the devs really failed to make Jewel and Quinn their own characters in this game, and I think that's a shame. I know they can do better, because they already did. Middle on the surface is very meek and frail. She's very sick and is bedridden for the entire game. She's very sweet and clearly loves her brother a lot, but unlike Jewel, she just gets to be his sister without having to leave the door open for romance. But like any sibling, she's not afraid to clown her brother's punk ass. She's a good kid. Her interactions with Copen are really cute, and the few moments of redemption and humanity his character has, at least in this series, even if he won't put on a dress and makeup to try and cheer her up. Around her, he seems a lot more like an emotionally repressed and awkward teen, and not a psycho killer. The fact that she has the rapport with Copen to be comfortable teasing him makes their relationship way more believable than the waifu rom-com nonsense Gunvolt had to deal with in his campaign. As much as I do like Middle's relationship with Copen, I think it could have done with a dusting of conflict sprinkled in to make it a little more believable. Since we're told Copen is smart, we can guess that Middle is a pretty smart girl too. They are twins after all. So it stands to reason that she might grow suspicious of whatever her brother is up to all day. And having a little story where she slowly starts to piece together what Copen's been doing could give her just a little bit more agency as a character. And right as the player wraps up beating the main bosses, she figures it out and confronts him. And when he can't tell her the truth, she runs away, which could lead to her getting kidnapped by Eden, and when it happens, it's his fault. I like the idea of characterizing Middle as just as intelligent as Copen, despite her frail body. Nori is Copen's maid. She is a character. She does things. 3 sentences is a paragraph, right? Copen is accompanied by Lola. She's a hybrid Tamagotchi, Vocaloid, and 3D printer that makes up for Copen's lack of personality and is the source of his sub-weapons. Copen shoves some shards of the plot mirror into Lola and turns her into his own Hatsune Miku, which is why he has access to the same save-your-ass sing-song mechanic I hated in the first game. She's one of my favorite characters. She's really sunny and quirky, and despite being a floating orb for most of the game, she acts a lot more like a normal person than anyone in the Gunvolt fan club. But even if I like her, it'd be unfair of me not to bring up the fact that her bright, energetic personality jars heavily with the fact that she's helping Copen kill a lot of people. Evil people, but people all the same. The support characters definitely left a bigger impact on me than they did in the first game, and made the world feel a lot more populated, even if I ended up disliking or being indifferent to most of them. The portrayal of its female characters definitely moved this series a little too close to the galgun side of the spectrum for my taste. Middle is the only one I'd really defend in terms of character writing, even if she's not terribly complex, just very likable and sympathetic. He's basically the same. He's still cool, but he definitely lets Jewel get away with too much in my opinion, which makes him seem like kind of a pushover. I think he could have also used a scene where he gave Jewel a piece of his mind. I also think it's weird how little the events of the previous game come up. Let's not forget that the last time we saw this guy, he saw his best friend get murdered right in front of him and then had to kill his mentor and father figure. He remembers that Zeno really likes anime. I'm not saying that Asimov should have come back from the dead, but I think his ghost should have loomed over the story, metaphorically speaking. Having some spooky encounters where Gunvolt keeps seeing him or even hearing him over the radio would be pretty cool, and could even have been incorporated into Zonda's ability to create illusions. Zonda basically has the same motivation as him, so it's weird he doesn't even think about him when confronting her. I like that he's well adjusted and isn't as depressive as other characters who are supposed to be cool, but I do wish I got the sense that the events of the previous game got to him more. One of the optional dialogue scenes does depict Gunvolt waking up in a cold sweat, flashing back to that fateful day, but it's kind of all we ever get. You could be forgiven for forgetting Copen was even in the first game, but he is impossible to ignore in this one. Wow, they got rid of his iconic hood. I wonder why they did that. Copen is fighting an uphill battle when it comes to being a likable character since he's basically an open racist, but the biggest problem isn't that he's unlikable, it's that he's really boring. He always speaks in a monotone whisper, and his dorky voice makes him impossible to take seriously as a rival. He's really religious, but he's not a passionate crusader roaring Deus Vult as he purges the heretics. We don't even really know why he hates Adepts so much, or if he even likes all the killing. If you want an example of how poorly written this guy is, in the opening, he's trying to save his sister from the ship that's about to crash, and Gunvolt is trying to land the ship, and Copen's first instinct is to try and kill him. Thankfully, since Copen is a brainless moron, he tries to kill Gunvolt with lightning, which gives him a burst of power and allows him to land the ship. If Copen had his way, his sister, and who knows how many other people, would be dead. If he intentionally powered Gunvolt up to help him land the ship, that would make sense. Yeah, these two don't like each other, but you'd think his sister's safety would be a bigger priority. All they needed to do was change the dialogue before Copen used his attack, and it would make his character more believable. It's hard to get into more detail without getting into spoilers, so I'll just say he's a really hateful character, but there's no depth to his hatred, and he doesn't have the charisma to make him the kind of gleeful villain that you love to hate. Most of the time we spend with the characters, playable or otherwise, is done through optional vignettes, similar to how you could interact with Jewel in the first game. And there's way more dialogue in this one. The dialogue is random, and there's enough variety to last 1 to 2 playthroughs. This is where you'll get to decide whether or not you like these characters. While I voiced my dislike for Quinn and Jewel, there are some endearing and charming exchanges in Gunvolt's playthrough. I definitely prefer the scenes with Middle, and I think that Nori's deadpan straightforwardness made for better comedy than Zhao's youthful earnestness. There's your character analysis. It helps add to that comfy vibe I was talking about in the first game, and gives these homicidal video game characters actual friends who they talk to and spend time with, which makes them a little bit more relatable. But I wonder if instead of giving the player random dialogue, maybe a linear unlock system that had the dialogue follow the progression of the story might make the two sides fit a little better. And having the dialogue you unlock relate to completed missions might reduce the likelihood of jarring chicken-related shifts in tone. This way, players who do care about the game's story won't miss out on important pieces of characterization, and would make it easier for players to rewatch scenes that they like or capture footage for a YouTube video. I appreciate extra dialogue being put to the side for people who want it, but I don't think it's a substitute for working that characterization into the core story. Making it random means the player might be missing out on the really good stuff. And don't expect me to believe it's all good stuff.
君はいつもそう言うけれど
GV ありがとうございます。あ、そうでした。エプロンが欲しいです。
Gunvolt also features mid-stage radio chatter from your various support characters. This can be fun and add to the sense that your character is working as a part of a team, and makes it feel like more of an organized operation. But the dialogue is pretty constant, and it's all in Japanese, which means if you want to keep up with the conversation, you're going to have to read while playing. Unless you can speak Japanese, which wouldn't be a problem if there was an option to just turn these off on your first playthrough, but you can't. The worst thing is that the dialogue screen will occasionally obscure gameplay, blocking bosses' attacks so you can't see what's about to hit you. Dialogue can also be interrupted by progressing too quickly. And what they say isn't always useful. A lot of times it's really basic stuff that you can figure out just by playing. Remember that episode of Sequelitis where Roll kept Mega Man! That's not parody anymore. That's just reality. In the last level, Lola was telling me to use bullet dashes to cross gaps. Right before the final boss, she was telling me how to use hex gates. Don't be afraid to let your character shut up. As long as the player has audio, I don't think there's anything wrong with having a buddy chime in from time to time with something useful, but it's almost constant in this game. There is some actually really funny and charming stuff you might miss out on, like how Gorina basically falls in love with Gunvolt during their rematch, or how Lola and Jewel get into arguments with green text. Defeating the Adepts has our hero, and Copen, take the fight to Eden to get the final piece back. Much like the first game, a female character is kidnapped, there's a boss gauntlet, someone wants to fuse with Hatsune Miku, and someone wants to wipe out humanity. You also get to fight Zonda's form from the original game, in one of my least favorite fights in the series. Asimov was the villain for about 10 minutes at the end of the first game, and Zonda really isn't any more compelling, and she has the center spotlight for the whole game. I guess she didn't start writing her evil plot until the day before it was due. She reveals to Copen that his sister was the original host for Hatsune Miku, and that she needs to fuse with her so she can gain her powers and kill humanity. Zonda merges with the Muse and applies this obnoxious high-pitched harmony filter to her voice and turns into the final boss. After defeating her, Middle falls to the floor and is presumably dead. Then, whichever character you're not playing as walks in. Copen will blame Gunvolt for his sister's death. They point their guns at each other. Roll credits. Getting the true ending in this game is still stupid, but didn't add as much to my playtime as the first. You need to complete both campaigns to get the true ending, but the bad ending isn't a bad ending. The bad ending just rolls the credits like one fight earlier. Nothing would be lost if you just saw the true ending right away. Gunvolt's ending makes a lot more sense as the justification for a fight. Copen walks in on Gunvolt standing over his sister's lifeless body, and naturally he assumes he had something to do with it. Copen's, on the other hand, feels a little bit more forced. He finds his sister's dead body, then Gunvolt just walks in for some reason, gets Copen's attention so he can blame him for his sister's death, even though he was there the whole time and knew he had nothing to do with it. Gunny should have just walked in, seen what was happening, and walked back out. I think the bad ending should have had Copen find his dead sister and carry her out without a word, with no proper final boss. With his sister dead, he has nothing left to fight for. It'd honestly be pretty powerful. But maybe the player could do something to save Middle. Then the good ending could have a scenario where Zonda has both Jewel and Middle captive and forces them to fight. This way, even if he didn't want to, Copen has a real reason to fight since there's a chance he could still save his sister. So, naturally, you fight the character you aren't playing as, and then when the other dies, fused Middle revives him. It makes a lot more sense for her to protect Gunvolt from Copen than it does for her to protect Copen from Gunvolt, because in both situations, Gunvolt isn't the one instigating the fight. And seeing that this seemed to annoy him as much as it did me was a moment I really related to the little guy, but made me resent all the other characters involved. Like, why would she revive him just to let them keep fighting? If she wants them to stop, you think she would say something. Like, what does she think is going to happen if she just makes one of them twice as strong and just lets them keep fighting? This scene just does not land for me. Mainly because this late in the game, I still feel like these characters barely know each other. Gunvolt 2 is a game where you play as a pair of rivals, but you don't care about the rivalry. They're both on the box, but in each other's campaigns they just feel like an afterthought. The one time you fight them during the campaign feels more like a mini-boss. The final battle is this big multi-phase showdown with a unique vocal track, and you just feel like these characters don't know each other. A good rivalry is like a good romance.
How about a kiss from your little brother?
The characters need to have chemistry so they can bounce off one another, but Copen and Gunvolt are too similar for their personalities to clash. Their interactions are some of the least memorable moments of the game. They don't even really seem that angry with each other. Between the two, Gunvolt is the more energetic and personable, Copen is definitely the more angry and hateful, and they both have their respectable moments of savagery, but I wouldn't describe either of them as fiery or passionate. They're both cool-headed, focused, and determined. They're too similar to be foils, but they don't really reflect each other's worst traits. Jewel and Quinn have a more compelling rivalry than these two. They don't really have a score that needs settling since these two barely know each other. Gunvolt didn't kill his dad, Copen doesn't think Gunvolt stole the Master Emerald, no one's threatening to kill his sister if he doesn't kill Gunvolt. They aren't even loyal to opposing factions. They basically don't have a reason to fight after Middle comes back to life, and even before that it still wasn't a good reason. To Copen, Gunvolt is just an especially powerful adept, and to Gunvolt, Copen is just an asshole. The reason Copen wants to fight Gunvolt is because he believes adepts are a threat to humanity and need to be exterminated, while Gunvolt thinks that adepts is humanity. Ignoring the fact that one of these is objectively morally wrong, the reason this isn't compelling is because Copen didn't come to this conclusion himself. This is what I mean when I say his hatred has no depth. Rather than pulling from his own lived experience, he's just following what someone else told him. And even if he did, he would still be in the wrong. Watching them interact is boring, and they don't really have anything meaningful to fight over, so their rivalry just feels skin deep. Playing as two rivals is the core selling point of this game. It's what separates it from the original, and their relationship is the least memorable thing about it. This story should have been all about why and how much these two hate each other. This should have been their game. And then they kiss. Whatever, at least the music's good. The fight ends with Middle coming to the defense of whoever you're fighting, so Middle and Jewel are just one guy now, and they were probably the same person from the start. Gunvolt's ending also makes more sense as he tells the defeated Copen to take Middle to a hospital, where Copen defeats Gunvolt and just says, "You get to live another day, adept," when he probably could have just ended things right now. And let's be honest, it's the kind of thing he would do. The last scene in his ending shows him bumping into Middle, and they have a little deja vu moment before going their separate ways. It's pretty sweet. She's better off now than she was being stuck in his head. Gunvolt's willing to let her go and can rest easy knowing that she's in good hands. Especially since Copen's ending shows us that he's out of her life. This is the moment I found myself growing completely cold to this character. Alright, gloves off. I don't just dislike Copen because he's racist. I think he is a terribly written character, because through everything he's been through, finding out his sister was an adept, constantly having Gunvolt try to de-escalate every encounter they've ever had, this whole time he is still hell-bent on killing all the adepts in the world. And for what? The only answer we get is something about his dad. Copen's dad, who I can only assume is the player character from Galgun, was a scientist who helped discover adepts and apparently regretted it before Sumeragi had him silenced. But Copen doesn't want revenge on Sumeragi or the specific adept that killed his father, so he's not a demon seeking vengeance. It's unclear whether or not his dad specifically asked him to do this, or if he just came to this solution himself. If the former, he's a terrible father. If the latter, then Copen is a total moron. He just feels like a character who doesn't even know what he's angry about. Middle is finally better after a lifetime of sickness and frailty, and what does Copen do? He just dips. He doesn't even say goodbye, nor he just kind of stands there. This is what I mean when I say Middle should have had more agency. It should be her out here begging him to stay so he can be a part of the future he helped give her. And what is so frustrating about this character is that he's hell-bent on carrying out this mission that nobody asked for. No one is making him do this. It's all his choice. He can't learn to live with his adept sister because he chooses not to. He's content to make himself miserable, and it's all the fault of the people he's killing. But why the hell is any random person with superpowers a bigger threat to humanity than this rich prick running around with his genocide jacket allowed to kill whoever he wants? How is Copen any different from an adept when he's literally using powers he stole from them? It's obvious at some point they're going to give Copen a redemption arc where he and Gunvolt level up to basically being able to stand each other. But by the time that happens, he'll have been such an asshole for so long I doubt I'll even care. God, I wish that were true. Copen's genocidal motivations are more befitting of a series antagonist, but because he's pretty, and he has a cute sister, and a funny robot sidekick, and we play as him, we're supposed to see him as a flawed and tragic hero. But if he looked like Sigma, people would see him as the vapid monster he is. Look, all I know is I'm just glad to be done with this guy. God damn it. I think there's some emotional satisfaction from this ending, but it definitely didn't leave me as excited for the series' potential as the first game's bitter ending. I'm excited to see a potential friendship and maybe even romance between Gunvolt and Middle, but something tells me this is goodbye, which is fine. I'd certainly hate to see her come back just for her to start acting like Jewel again. I'm excited to see these characters again in a third game. I just hope the developers do better by them. So that's the Gunvolt duology. I think I like them. I think Gunvolt 1 is the better game overall. It's just more consistent. It's got the better boss fights, and hard mode alone is enough to make it the better game for me. The story is kind of absent, and when it does get going, it still fails to make the most of its setting. And the characters really fail to make an impact. Not to mention that horrible final boss, which ensures I won't be doing a full playthrough of it anytime soon. GV2 has Copen in it, but it also has Copen in it. While it expanded the cast, which had some great additions, I can take or leave most of them. The terrible bosses really bring this game down from just being a straight upgrade, and the absence of a hard mode means that the game doesn't really reach the heights of the first one. Plus, its story is a mess, but it's still more functional than the story of the previous one. It had a lot more going for it, but it also just had so much more to fumble. Probably the biggest disappointment with this series is the music. I mean, did you even notice that I didn't talk about it at all? With the exception of a few vocal tracks, it's all super forgettable. And if you're a Mega Man fan, you know that's unacceptable. I think this series has a really strong mechanical foundation with its kudo system and checkpoint system, and I really appreciate the absence of lives in this series. I can't debase myself enough in honor of that decision. It feels like they really want to make this series more approachable. And I appreciate a lot of the little easy mode features in place to help new players, and I appreciate how a lot of them can be ignored or turned off. I think pre-evasion is a great mechanic, at least in theory, and while getting revived by Jewel annoyed me, I like that it's contextualized by a friendly NPC. I think the mark system is a great way to add complexity to the combat, but I still feel like the game hasn't really had marking do anything other than just deal damage. It's something else I hope gets explored more down the line. While I think Gunvolt and Copen are fun to play, I think they could both benefit from some more high-risk offensive options, like a saber hilt you could channel lightning into like a blade. or some lightning-infused martial arts or gun kata, as a lot of the combat tends to feel automated after you make your marks. I think these games did a really good job of encouraging replays in a way that the earlier games just didn't. The combo system, letter grades, and synthesis system all give the player reasons to keep coming back. I think there's strength to build on, so I'm looking forward to seeing what they do in the future. It's a different story for the story. While neither game has a great or even good story, the setting and characters did do a good job of sparking my imagination in the same way the Mega Man games did when I was young. Even if most of that imagination was about how to don't say fix, improve on the strengths of the story, I still think this is an awesome setting with potential to tell some really compelling stories, but whether or not we get to experience those stories remains to be seen. This series has had a pretty tough time making compelling villains, as everyone seems to be some variant of genocidal maniac. Zonda and Nova are both completely absent from the climaxes of their stories. It doesn't help that they're both terrible characters in their own right. Copen and Asimov have much more potential, but they're just as equally shallow. And the climaxes show a troublesome pattern for the series moving forward. The gameplay is on a pretty steady incline of improvement, but I hope the story can do something to catch up. I wouldn't say I'm expecting it, but I love to be wrong. I'd certainly hate to be back here after another 8 years talking about how great the Gunvolt series could have been. Well, I think that's everything. I guess I'm a Gunvolt fan now. What are we called? I mean, are we Volters? Strikers? The Blue Army? Do we say GAC? Does anyone else say GAC? When someone posts cringe, do we say they photobombed the moment? Please let me know. I'm desperate for human contact.